Down in Alabama, fall guaranteed you a few things. One was that it was still going to be humid and you never know when a thunderstorm would strike. It would meant that once you had made the rounds at the few houses handing out candy, the night was there little else to do but get into trouble. What is this story about? When letting my true feelings take over the driver's seat, running out of constructive things to do to collide, it did not help that I was less popular variety at school, which wearing a mask was a relief from my regular torment. Those preteen hormones and small town life were a ticking time bomb if you ever known one. What was it that saying? Idle hands of the devil's plaything? The saxophone president was busy yapping on the television, and my mother was buttering up my father in an attempt to getting to see the Titanic when it came to feed-ears. I was busy working on my Halloween costume at the kitchen table, trying to tune both of them out. When you grow up in a single-wide trailer in Podunk, Alabama, you do tend to not have the funds for the fancier things, but I was growing tired of going as bedsheet ghosts and hobo clown. I wanted to be scary. I wanted to be a real monster. I wanted to make Jeffrey Scott wet his pants in front of the dim-witted football jock friends. I wanted to be anything but the poor, miserable old fat kid for the night. I could just not let my mom know I was using her makeup. A few brown stitches and a drop of old cloth, some old pine straw, and a pair of overalls and my dad flannel shirt. It did not look like much by itself with the right amount of tweaking that made it more of an interesting scarecrow. It was still missing something, however. My Pawpaw Mac had always been good for ideas, and he knew the way to top off to get my get-up. Literally, it took a bit of digging through the tool shed, and that was a place from a mess front to go back, Granny said. She had no idea how he kept track of everything out there, but he managed to find the straw that he was looking for. It was missing quite a few strands, and you could tell it's been in the shack of a mouse for two, but it fit perfect. His trusty old-timer made a few jagged cuts in my pants, and he said with a wash or two, it would look like a proper rug. He told me that if I got into trouble, just to go tell my parents about it, what he was doing. They did not question him in anything. When the sun went down a little, I let down the driveway on my homemade costume, hand-me-down hat, and a potato sack my granny had rustled up for me, gathering my take for the night. The grin behind it was the ugly material that could have been used to scare anyone if they could have seen it. I was so excited about it I could barely contain it. I was bounding from door to door in no time. Some of the porch lights had not even clicked on yet, while I waited eagerly for the late arrivals to retrieve their treats, belting out of the command for candy. Trick or treat! My sack was half full within the first hour, but there was no way I was tuning in early. This was one of the best days of the year, second only to Christmas, and even could be disappointing when your parents are broke. Free candy was free candy, and that was more than enough to help me forget about the beads of sweat that coated my body under that thick material. That night I was rounding out, much like my sack, when I noticed Jeffrey and his goons making their rounds with the younger kids. They were not satisfied with gathering candy. They had to have it all. I knew all too well what could happen if they knew who hid beneath the face, so I carefully crafted. I had to make sure that I get the first hand in. So I made a quick sprint for the trees that separated the neighborhood to my next. The cluttered clumps of trees made it good for hiding while I worked up my plan. That potato sack did not want to fold up with how full it was, and I knew that the dirt ants would take all my hard work. So I figured it would be best to hide it in a tree. Let me just say now, it was hard for a big boy to climb a tree, but the candy was burning in my eyes and irritating the hell out of my thighs. But I was determined to get my revenge for every spoiled on Hallows Eve. It took a few throws, but eventually a pecan landed square across Jeffrey Scott's nose. The chase was on, and it took almost I could not to laugh as they followed me deeper in the woods. I weaved in and out of the trees, but I knew that eventually they would catch up to me. Remember, I was the fat kid, and these days were football ogres. I had to play it smart and possibly set up a trap. I had passed a few rusted out old Fords that I knew I could hide and squat behind the holly heap of the Detroit muscle. I tried to catch my breath and long waited for the horde to bound over, and the last hill I had crossed getting down there. It took longer than I thought of them to try and catch up. The bubblicious I had shoved in my cheeks earlier that night already lost its flavor by the time I heard the leaves rustle. It was so dark I could barely see them, but it was easy to tell their location by flickering the lights of their flashlights. The sounds of shuffling came to a stop a few yards away and were replaced by voices arguing back and forth over which way to go. They had passed me in their efforts to close up the gap, and now I sat between them, and it was a perfect opportunity to creep up behind them and make them pay for every piece of candy and tear the so-cloth spirit costume I had ever existed. I had never been so much of a hunt, but I knew that if you wanted to be quiet enough just to keep from scaring off a deer, you made sure your steps were heel to toe to deliberate. I felt like a real monster for stalking its victims, and my heart pounded in my chest with excitement. When I was sure my next action would be to get the best result, I gave them a best rendition of a rebel yell. Three of them ran without looking back, and Jeffrey spun his heel, eyes wide searching for the source of the scare. The look on his face was priceless. Mama always says to me to make sure you tie your shoes. She would go on and on about how one day I would trip on one of those things and ended up in the emergency room. Well, Jeffrey Scott's mama had obviously driven home that lesson because he just came home to see my ghoulish mask, his other foot landed firm on his untied shoelace, and sent him tumbling back. I expected to see an explosion of brown and orange leaves. Instead, Jeffrey disappeared altogether. I crept closer as my feet came to rest just beyond where the bully once stood. I noticed the ground gave a bit and faded into a shorty after. 10 feet below me lay Jeffrey Scott. He had to become one of the hood ornament for a decaying John Deere. The boy the tractor laid lifeless. The scene was almost poetic, really, but by the time my 11-year-old mind could not properly process it, it was not long after I found myself sobbing in my mother's arms. I had removed the mask early that night and had not had the will to put on the happy sunshine one that could have replaced it. Mama fought for a good 30 minutes trying to understand the hobbled-up rambling of the story I tried to tell. I think I apologized more times on that night than I should have, since she had a piece of it all stirred together. And when my father stumbled with the Bud Light in hand, she pulled him into the kitchen, and I listened to the hushed rendition of what I tried to tell earlier. They both returned shortly after, my father seemingly a bit somber, suddenly from the news. He finished off his drinks, crushed a can, and let out my pawpaws. The two of them made another lap and trip to the tool shed and merged the shovel each. I did not have to watch with the direction where they were heading. And meanwhile, my mother dried my tears and ran me a bath. She told me that she would be back shortly to get me in bed. I heard her lift the receiver onto the phone of the kitchen. She gave me my brother a call, and just as Uncle Dave to me, but just the town knew him as Sheriff McDougall. It took me a long time for me to get to sleep that night, but the next morning my potato sack full of candy was waiting for me at the edge of my bed. Mama did not make me go to school the next day. Dad had offered to take me fishing. He never did that. I was not up for the trip, though. I stayed in bed most of the day, chewing on my Tootsie Rolls and Smarties. When I did go back to school, I got a fair amount of looks and no one said a word to me. Jeffy's seat sat there emptied, but Miss Reynolds was wiping a tear from her eye when she entered. She did not call out for the missing child's name during the roll call. Some of the kids were whispering about the flu going around and Jeffrey being at home sick. But that bit of gossip only lasted for about a week. The missing child posters then suddenly came next. Mr. and Mrs. Scott came by to the house a few times. Mama offered them sweet tea. Dad handed Dale a beer. It was odd watching them act as if nothing had happened at all. Miss Scott cried a bit, that tugged on me somewhere deep in my stomach. But I dare not to say anything. Dad gave me that look he always had after too many cans of Budweiser. I still cannot make any sense why the two of them did what they had. What everyone in town actually knew, or why no one asked me if I ever saw Jeffrey Scott. What I did learn on that Halloween was two important things. First, there is a deep gully in the woods behind my neighborhood, a place Uncle Dave made sure no one searched for the following days on following Halloween. Secondly, you should never threaten a Salvern Mama's baby boy.